Welcome to Your Journey, a podcast with Ishan Shivanand. My name is Juhi Gangarmani, and every week we bring episodes to our listeners that address topics ranging from meditation and maintaining well-being to how we address anxiety and mental health challenges people face. We hope to give you more clarity and support on how to cope with daily and lifelong stressors while we support and uplift you on your journey. Welcome, everyone. Today's episode will be focusing on what it means to lose a loved one and experiencing grief. While loss is a universal experience, grief means and impacts people in different ways. And Ishanji, I'd just like for you to help our listeners understand what is grief and how do we identify that we're struggling with processing grief?
Grief signifies the loss of something important in your life. It can be a loved one, it can be a situation. It is the loss of that attachment, that comfort in which we were living. Once that loss occurs, grief is signified as the reaction that we face when that situation comes in our life. There are emotional aspects of grief, there are cognitive aspects of grief, there are even physiological aspects of grief. And if we look at the various responses to grief, then we have the Kubler Ross model, which has been debunked. So that was denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then finally acceptance. And that showed a very straightforward trajectory which every person takes when grief comes in their life. And then a gentleman called George Bonanno, he debunked that model because he did extremely extensive research on people that have been affected, displaced by war, and he had pre-grief data as well. So his research was scientifically applauded by his peers. He gave a different model whereas he said that there can be other reactions to grief as well. In one model, he said there is going to be resilience. So resilience, in which he stated that not every single human being will go through the stages of grief, anger, denial, depression. Some people will just go through that phenomena and accept that yes, things happen and they will come out of that situation um, understanding and accepting things that have happened. And then he talked about recovery, where he said there is going to be an impact of the grief, but then gradually um, the person will suffer the symptoms of grief, which could be crying, which could be sadness, and then a person can come out of it. Then he talks about chronic dysfunction, where a loss has happened and that has somehow permanently changed you. So instead of recovery, we are not the same person. We don't laugh the way we used to. We don't feel motivated the way we were. One of the most common symptoms that I've heard people talk about is, I can't love the way that I did. I don't have the same motivation to live for. For example, my mother, she was my rock. She was the one for whom I wanted to be successful. She was the one who I wanted to show how strong I am and how successful I can be, because she did so much for me. And now when she's gone, what is the point? So a nihilism can set him, and that can affect a person's life on a chronic scale. And then Bonanno talks about delayed onset, delayed grief, delayed trauma. Whereas at first, the person may appear resilient, strong, and somehow the emotions have been repressed. But gradually, as time goes on and the person spends more time with himself, then that which has been pushed in jumps out, and then we don't know what to do with it. And then it becomes this demon that is affecting our life and making us feel miserable. So, grief is something that is first we thought quite unique to just Homo sapiens, but now we know animals like elephants, wolves, some birds also experience grief, but not at the scale of human beings. And we still don't understand what's the evolutionary advantage of grief. But it is such a strong and powerful emotion that every single person under the blue sky will go through. Because when we are born, there is attachment to the mother. Even if the mother doesn't deserve attachment, because not everybody is blessed with the best parents. But as a child, biologically, there is a need, a desire to be loved, to be held, to be accepted. And that's the job of parents, to accept you the way you are. But human beings can be judgmental. Monkeys are not. Or even if they are not so very detailed about it. And irrespective of all the judgment or all the nonsense that may be given to us by our family, there is still attachment. And wherever there is attachment, there is going to be loss. And loss will lead to grief. So it's very important that as human beings, we understand what grief is and we have a plan of action in which we know how to deal with it when it comes, or recognize that maybe some of the things that's happening in our life could be signs of chronic grief. Even though we don't look at it as loss, but for example, a child that has lost the love of a parent, maybe not the parent as well, because in Africa, when I was working, I saw there were a lot of single parent households to no parent households, and not because the parent had been lost. Sometimes the parent is incarcerated, or sometimes the parent is non-existent, so an unwanted child, and the unwanted child is just left to its own predicaments. And maybe the grandfather or the compassion of the village is sustaining that child, but that is not healthy. So the child will act very tough and strong, but in some way or the other, the grief, the chronic grief that Bonanno talks about, is affecting that person. And it could be in anything. It could be in terms of sorrow, in terms of desensitization, feeling disconnected from the body, from relations that are around, lack of motivation. It could be this heaviness that we carry in our heart. And it's very important to recognize and try to heal what has happened, because that is what can help a human being.
I'd like to ask you, why is it important for us to work through our feelings when experiencing the loss of a loved one, as they can be overwhelming and difficult to deal with?
Is it important to have two legs? If you have one leg, locomotion will be hard. Why is it important to have balance? Because it's hard falling down every few seconds. If we have unresolved emotion, or if we feel that, because see, the thing is, when the Kubler-Ross model was accepted model, then a lot of the times people would say, process your grief in the way that society deems necessary, as in, go through the stages. You are in denial, because Kubler-Ross model, the first stage is denial. So person says, I'm not feeling, I don't want to bawl and cry and howl. But this model says, no, you are in denial, cry, cry. And we found out that was unhealthy. You can't push somebody to feel something. So some people are resilient, some people do have excellent recovery, but right now we are talking about the people who do not, who are going through some form of chronic or delayed effects of the loss that they have gone through. And this is not a good way to live your life, because I come back to the understanding that we have in Eastern theology or Eastern philosophy, that it is the birthright of every single person to be happy. How can we be happy if we are constantly stuck in a situation and behavior that will affect us? I will give you an example that in Yog Vashisht, it is written, it's one of the most powerful psychological, philosophical manual that has been created ever. This was basically when Bhagwan Ram, Lord Ram, a theological figure in Eastern spirituality, who is considered a god king, he was going through intense dispassion, intense, in a way, grief. But what he lost wasn't a person or a loved one. What he lost was his understanding of the world. So a cognitive dissonance. So he thought the world to be in a certain place, and then this truth was revealed to him, and he saw the world in all its weirdness and nuttiness and all the toxicity that exists in the world, and he just didn't understand that why is the world the way it is. So then a great monk by the name of Vashisht talked to him, and in that conversation, Vashisht said that grief can be one of the most important tool of transformation. He called this whole phenomena as Vishad Yoga. So his understanding was that yog basically means union. So there can be different forms of union. Union with the infinite, union with the inner strength, union with the God that lives inside you. So there's Hatha Yoga, people who do lots of yoga, physical exercises. There can be the meditation yoga, people who utilize meditation to connect with the infinite self. Vashisht talked about Vishad Yoga, meaning union to the infinite through sorrow. And when he came to Bhagwan Ram, he said, oh my God, this is the most perfect stage that you have reached. Because he basically explained that there are a few stages to life. First is creation, then there is maintenance, then there is destruction. So to every single sequence that will happen in your life, every single relationship, every single job, every single thing, you'll create it, you'll maintain it, and then it will be taken away from you. So after destruction, he said two things can happen. If you accept the whole situation, then you can go out of it, and then you will go to the another cycle of creation, maintenance, and destruction. Or you will stand on the door of destruction, you will stand on the funeral pyre, and you will try to crawl back into what was. And that, Vashish said, can never happen. A child who's once born cannot go back into the womb. A person who's dead cannot come back to life. But imagine if we hold the fantasy of just wanting things the way they were. That is what leads to the birth of all superstitions. Whereas some person who will come to you and say, hey, wear this ring and things will happen the way they were. And it's amazing. I didn't know that. Fortune teller and all those things, even in places like United Kingdom, are worth $1 billion industry, because people call and say, hey, I lost this love, I lost this thing. Do you have some magical enchantment or something like that, so that the person can be back and we can be the way we were? And that, Vashesh said, will just lead to a lot of depression. That depression will lead to nihilism. Nihilism means a thought process in which nothing in life matters. That nihilism will lead to unnecessary consumption, that if nothing matters, then let me just engage my senses in whichever way I can and live this life in just physiological fulfillments. Or, Vashish said, if we have the ability to process our grief, then this is the time from grief we can lead ourselves to enlightenment. And that is what Vashisht talked about. And if we look at Buddha's life, we'll see the same thing. Even his model of the world was questioned, and he used that grief to lead himself to enlightenment. So grief is expected. Grief is absolute. It's going to happen. But if it's going to come, then a spiritual man says, why? Why waste it? If it has the power, then why not utilize it in a way that I become more resilient, stronger, and possibly even enlightened?
I love how you referenced resilience when we've previously talked about this in our other episode, and how many people just present their different strengths in different ways. I'd like to ask how you think that grief impacts our mental health and well-being long term.
There are stages of development. There are ways in which a human body evolves. If there is unprocessed grief, then we don't go through those stages of maturity which are healthy. We don't reach to that point of balance and stability which our peers who do not have grief or who have processed their grief been through. A person may act like a child even though they are not a child. But because when they were a child, they suffered through an experience which made them stuck in that experience, and when the milestones came where they could become emotionally mature, they skipped those milestones. And now, as an adult, when they have to react in a certain manner, they are not reacting in that manner and causing more grief to them. Because the thing is, when a person is suffering through a emotional predicament, in their minds they are correct. And that is amazing. Every single person thinks they are correct. There is this old adage, I don't know if you've ever heard it, that every villain is a hero of their own story. If you ask a villain's perspective, the antagonist is going to say that I was right. It was Batman who was wrong. Every Ravan is going to say, of course I was right, I needed to do that, and he will give you justifications. And when he will, of course, and that's why, when a divorce happens, each child gets affinity towards each parent. And it's not just sometimes a divorce of parents, it's a divorce of sibling as well. Because one sibling is listening to the father, and the father is telling his side of the story, and in his side of the story the mother is the villain, and then one sibling is hearing the mother's side of the story, and in the mother's side the father is the villain. And both the children start to fight with each other, that how could you take his side, don't you know what he's done? How could you take her side, don't you know what she has done? And this will happen. Now imagine a person who has this unprocessed grief that is causing him this emotional blockage that's not allowing him to process life in a healthy manner. Then in his mind, they will always be a victim. And they will always find everybody else's behavior irrational. And I'm not saying they are the villain, but in their story, they'll be the victim. They'll look at everybody else as the villain. Why are they not acting in a certain way? And that kind of a life will just lead to more grief. Whereas if our emotions are processed, we get a very deeper, higher understanding of the world that is around us and of the world that is inside us. That understanding allows us to process emotions in a different manner, in a healthy manner. And we can go through life happier than before. And that's why instead of thinking that why or what are the impacts of long-term grief on our body and mind, we should think about strategies to let go of those grief.
Leads me perfectly into my last question about how we can use self-care practices and meditation to help us process our grief. So, what are some ways that you would recommend our listeners to practice these resilience strategies?
Because grief is so unique in a way to human beings, and human beings are so vocal about it, you will find a lot of theology is there, just there to help us process grief. If we look at any religious book, slowly, gradually, it's teaching us to process our grief in a way. I'm not saying the best way, but in a way. Even in India, we have three very powerful books that, in fact, four, I would say, that help us. The first book is Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita teaches us about the transient nature of this body and life, and how we should focus upon not the transient nature, but that which is permanent. So, understanding the nature of the soul. and trying to connect to the soul and sort of uplift our consciousness from the body. And I feel, as a study, if the youth can even understand the basic concepts of the Bhagavad Gita, it's a very beautiful manual that can help us, especially overcome loss of loved ones. Then we have another manual, which is a very ancient manual called Kathopanishad. I don't know if even the West it's available. This is a very interesting premise in which a young boy has a conversation with death. So think if Meet Joe Black, the Brad Pitt movie, existed in a parallel universe, but much more detailed and much more powerful. So this child has so many questions he wants to ask death. Questions about life, questions about the purpose, questions about objective of why he was on this earth. And death very compassionately answers him. And that philosophy is very beautiful. So if you can, then of course, Kathopanishad is something that will help you in the grieving process. And then of course there are the religious texts. But that I think is a bit more scary than compassionate and healing, because in that religious text, there's this like Garur Puran, there is the Bible, then there's Dante's Inferno, and then we are starting to talk about heaven and hell, and then then it's like you are being scared into come out of grief. So I don't know, maybe it works for some people, and sure, definitely you can have that approach as well. And then of course, when we talked about Yog Vashisht, that is also a very beautiful manual. These are the studies that you can do. When it comes to personal space, meditative space, then there is a very powerful meditation that I sometimes teach and I recommend people to have. In that, I tell a person to take their awareness to top of the head, the kapal, and in that place, try to visualize a deep, powerful, divine light. Let's assume that this light is our higher self. This is the light that comes into the body. This is the light that will go out of the body. This is the light that exists even before the body existed. This is the light that will continue to exist even after the body would be gone. This is the light that witnesses the dream as we sleep. This is the light that guides us as we live. So when we inhale, feel your consciousness going from the head all the way down to your toes. And when you exhale, feel as if you're pushing your life force up, leaving behind your body and trying to merge with this light. So when you've exhaled completely, you've left behind your consciousness and you are one with the light. When you breathe like this for a few minutes, then being unified with this light, try to witness your life the way it is. Non-judgmental, non-reactionary awareness. Just try to look at your body, look at your life, look at the things that are around you, look at the people that are around you, look at the relationships that are around you, and just witness them. And slowly, when you are mindful of your existence through the consciousness of the higher self, you will find yourself to be more resilient, more aware, and slowly have the ability to disconnect from the grief. But I would also recommend, if you have a theological inclination, prayer. Prayer will help you. Prayer can be looked at from different perspectives. One is prayer for the one who is gone, if you have suffered loss. A simple prayer that wherever they are, I hope they are happy. I surrender them to the will of the divine infinite. Second, prayer can be for yourself. I hope and pray I can come out of this. I connect to the infinite that is all around me, and I seek strength and wisdom so that the ones who remain with me, I can be there for them. And lastly, what I would recommend is, as a preventative method, try to be as honest, as genuine, as respectful of time in current relationships. So know the transient nature, that this is temporary. If you are with your father today, then no, he will not be there forever. Many times I see when a parent is gone, a person is crying sometimes not because the father is gone, but crying because there is guilt that I did not love enough when the person was there. And in India, you will find so many rituals of honoring the dead. When the father goes, they're putting flowers on the father. And the crazy thing is, when the father was alive, nobody put flowers on him then. But now they are putting flowers. Now they are trying to make themselves feel nicer, trying to find some form of completion to this grieving process. And my question is, why not do that? Honor the gentleman while he is alive. So that when that person goes, there'll be no guilt that, oh, I did not give my 100% to that relationship. If we are genuine, then that will help us go towards resilience, of what George Bonanno talks about. That some people do have the capacity to deal with grief in that manner as well.
Thank you for listening to the Your Journey podcast. Make sure to follow us on social media to keep up with the latest episodes with the @your_journey_podcast. We hope to join you again on the next episode of Your Journey.